Welcome back to our APES Flipped Classroom, where we are wrapping up our Unit 2 conversations. And as you've noticed, we've combined a little bit of Unit 9 into Unit 2. So our last conversation that we're going to have on the subject of biodiversity is about human threats to biodiversity. So how we impact the biodiversity of our areas. So we're going to jump right in, and we're going to kind of talk about there are 6 categories that we can break down our impact on biodiversity. And so the first one is habitat loss. So we'll use the mnemonic HIPPCO to remember the 6 factors. So the first one is habitat fragmentation or habitat loss. And this comes through deforestation, through the draining of wetlands, through changing of river water levels by damming or by removing dams, although that restores it to where it was before. So when we talk about deforestation, we're talking about whether it is clear cutting for lumber or whether we are cutting for development, for cities, for roads. Anytime that we are deforesting, we're removing habitat. And of course, wetlands draining, we've talked about. This is frequently done for agricultural purposes because there's very rich soil in wetlands, but also in urbanization. And that also includes filling in wetlands. And then of course, when we change river water levels. So that's habitat fragmentation and loss. And we're gonna go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So invasive species, so remember invasive species are those species that have been brought in either intentionally or unintentionally by human beings. So those are things like zebra mussels, kudzu, even nutria. And those outcompete the native species for food or for space or for both. And what that does is it lowers the populations of the native species. And of course, population growth. And population growth is related to habitat fragmentation because our human population growth drives that habitat loss as we take more and more space for agriculture, for growing enough crops to feed the human beings, but also urbanization and urban sprawl as we remove or fragment that habitat. The second P is for pollution. Remember, we want to be specific when we talk about pollution, but we can talk about a lot of different types of pollution that are responsible for removing biodiversity. So when we have oil spills in the ocean, that's going to reduce marine organism population size. Pesticides that we use on agriculture or on our lawns not only kill the target species, but also non-target species. And that also has an impact on biodiversity because then we have fewer organisms. The C stands for climate change. Climate change can actually shift biomes and therefore our habitat ranges of our species. It can also change temperature and precipitation patterns too quickly, and species can't adapt in time and can't migrate, which causes populations to decline and potentially even to go extinct. And then the O in HIPPCO stands for overexploitation. So this is overuse of any resource, frequently hunting and poaching at rates that are higher than reproductive rates. And so those organisms can't survive to reproduce, and that leads to population declines and potential extinctions. All right, so let's jump into each of these individually. So when we talk about habitat fragmentation, there's a lot of different reasons for habitat fragmentation. There are a lot of different ways that we fragment habitat. One of the key ones is roads and pipelines. So roads and oil and gas pipelines fragment habitats, creating those biogeographical islands. This disrupts movement within the populations. It can lead to fatal collisions with vehicles if it's roads. If they're pipelines, then we also have the potential for spills, and that falls under pollution. So this is just a quick example. These pictures are from northern Alberta, so a northern part of Canada. And we have pictures from 1949, 1964, 1982, and then 1991. And you can see from these satellite images just how much of the natural green space is being lost, and what remains is being much more fragmented, which creates the potential for animals to not be able to travel. Those populations can't intermix. We also have agricultural and urban land use that causes habitat fragmentation. We frequently clear forest for agricultural fields. We'll clear grasslands for agricultural fields. And also urbanization fragments those habitats. So when we start talking about urban sprawl, we're all familiar with the increasing suburbanization of the area in which we live. So we're losing the biodiversity of those natural spaces. And then logging is one of the ones that people typically think of. There's two factors when we talk about logging. One is the creation of roads for the logging vehicles. And then the other one, of course, the more obvious one, is the removal of the trees themselves, which reduces habitat for the animals. So when we talk about habitat fragmentation, we are talking about breaking up larger continuous habitats into those smaller isolated patches, so those terrestrial islands. And it disrupts breeding, it disrupts hunting, and it disrupts migration. Okay, so that's the H in HIPPCO. Moving on to the I in HIPPCO. Oh, not moving on to the I in HIPPCO yet. Sorry. When we talk about habitat fragmentation, some species are going to be more disrupted by that fragmentation than others. And usually those are the large predators because they need large hunting spaces. It can also be those K-selected mammals. I know we haven't talked about K-selected yet. K-selected means that they are larger animals that provide a lot of care of their young, and they have long lifespans and late reproduction. So if you have small populations and they're fragmented from the other populations, then we're going to have a hard time finding mates. It creates those isolated subpopulations, which are going to have less genetic diversity. They're more prone to inbreeding depression, and they're less resilient. So any environmental disturbance or disease is going to have a larger impact. When we talk about a metapopulation, we are talking about isolated subpopulations that are connected by those habitat corridors. So those might be wildlife bridges. They might be little areas where the animals can move from one to another. This can allow some gene flow. We have intermixing between the populations, and that does improve genetic diversity. So if we go back to the theory of island biogeography, you guys remember that the closer it is to the mainland, the more diversity there's going to be. So by creating these corridors, we are essentially bringing it closer to the mainland. We're providing a safe space for the animals to be able to mix between the subpopulations. Okay, another impact of habitat fragmentation is edge habitat. So this is where two ecosystems meet. They have different characteristics, and the edge habitat has different characteristics than the middle of either ecosystem. So some species are going to thrive in edge habitat. Deer are a great example of a species that thrives in edge habitat because they have the safety of the forest to retreat to and the shade and the shelter. But there's more food at the edge because the things that they eat need sunlight. So we have more food, we have more nutrient resources. Edge habitats can also expand the range of some disruptive species, like the brown-headed cowbird. It thrives in this grassland forest edge. Brown-headed cowbird is a parasite. It lays its eggs in other birds' nests, and they raise those chicks unknowingly, and the brown-headed cowbird babies are more demanding and larger and frequently wind up killing off the actual songbirds' young simply by outcompeting them. So we do have, with edge habitat, some organisms that thrive in edge habitat, but many of those organisms are disruptive organisms. On the other hand, organisms that need that middle ecosystem space are going to struggle as we break up the ecosystem and create more edge habitat. Okay, now on to the C for climate change. So climate change, we can talk about temperature change. When we have warming temperature, it can shift our biomes farther north. When possible, organisms will shift northward. Of course, this means as it shifts ever northward, the amount of tundra is going to decrease. As permafrost thaws, there's going to be less and less tundra. Other habitats are going to be able to shift northward. So we can see our temperature change from 1901 to 2002. We can see our biomes in 1961 to 1990. And you can see in this projection that these biomes are shifting northward. Okay, precipitation change is another big piece of climate change. As we have warming temperatures, that's going to decrease precipitation in some areas, which will lead to soil desiccation, desertification, which is going to obviously have a huge impact on biodiversity because there's going to be inadequate water and nutrient supplies for some organisms. On the other hand, it's going to increase precipitation in some areas, which is going to expand those tropical ecosystems. Precipitation changes also increase the number of severe storms, which can cause significant environmental disruption. And then the third piece of climate change is sea level rise. So our estuary habitats, our salt marshes, our mangroves may become fully submerged. They may become more saline, which means that the organisms that are adapted to live in the lower salinity are going to struggle to survive. And our coastal ecosystems are going to become flooded. Remember that those estuaries have emergent plants, but if the water level gets deeper, the emergent plants aren't going to be able to continue to survive there, like the mangroves. So our climate change can shift the range of habitats. It can increase the range of the habitats. It may decrease the range of their habitats, as in the case of the tundra. Okay. Domestication. So how does that have an impact on biodiversity? So the first and most obvious one is crop species. As we have ever more selective breeding and genetic modification, we're growing fewer plant species. In the early 1900s, we had thousands of different species of all of our commercially sold vegetables. These days, we have hundreds, and that's simply because we are growing only those highest yield species, and so we have less genetic diversity in our crops, which makes them more vulnerable to disease and to environmental disruption. Similar impact with livestock. We used to have thousands of breeds of livestock, and these days, many of those breeds are extinct or at risk because we are selecting only for the highest productivity. Decreasing that diversity makes those organisms also more vulnerable to disruptions. So whenever we domesticate, we decrease genetic and species biodiversity. All right, how can we help? How can we mitigate this biodiversity loss? So one way that we can help is by protecting important habitats. We can create national parks. We can create nature preserves. We can prevent them from being developed. We can also connect those fragmented habitats with wildlife corridors. That way we have that connected metapopulation, so the subpopulations can mix and we can have increased genetic diversity. So there's a picture of a wildlife corridor. You'll see some of these that are bridges. There are others that are tunnels. Either way, it is a safe way for wildlife to cross large roads. Another way we can help with biodiversity loss is by decreasing. You notice that a lot of this has to do with habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. So if we set boundaries on urban growth by building up, not out, we can reduce urban sprawl and preserve existing habitats. We can also create spaces within cities. So whether that's parks or urban gardens or even green roofs, which have been shown to increase biodiversity, that provides habitat for many species. Sustainable agriculture is a huge piece of mitigating biodiversity loss. So when we go into the agriculture section of AP Environmental, we'll talk about what that means in terms of sustainable agriculture. And that can help to prevent habitat loss. Meat consumption is a big piece of that. Meat requires 20 times as much space for the same number of calories. So anything we can do to reduce the amount of land being used for agriculture preserves land for animals. And then, of course, restoring lost habitats, replanting clear-cut forests, reestablishing prairies, old fields that are maybe available, or even old golf courses. So we can restore those lost habitats. Okay, and your practice FRQ for tonight is to describe one economic disadvantage and one economic advantage of preserving a piece of land as a wildlife preserve. As always, let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to seeing you in class.